Hello everybody, we're going to be taking a look at our dice notation assignment, question 1. There's a bit of preamble to it, so I'll go over that here as well, although that's also applicable to the second question. Just a reminder that you're supposed to hand in your questions on Microsoft Teams. There is a video that shows you how to do it. I think it's sort of at the end of a video about how Teams generally works. It's all about your classroom notebook. Every student has their own private notebook. You just make a new page in the notebook and call it, I think I told you to call it dice notation assignment, and then you could cut and paste your answers in there. You're welcome to use an editor to answer these questions. You could type it out in Notepad or something. I personally am going to use a program called Atom. Maybe I'll just quickly go over to atom.io. I can show you can download this browser. It's got a nice looking AutoCAD. Hey, is this related to GitHub in some way? I'm showing my ignorance. I'm sure it is. And it's a quality editor that can be used for any programming language, actually. It's pretty amazing. You can download it for Windows, but if I visited here on a Mac, it would have a download for a Mac. It knows what computer I'm in because it's a smart website, and it's a pretty nice looking thing. I've saved my my file here as a .java file, and so as I start typing, it will syntax highlight. So I can do simple dice notation. And it has nice features like, completing braces if you like that kind of thing. And, it's good. It's not a compiler, though. It can be linked to a compiler, so I could compile this. But as it is, it's just an editor that syntax highlights. And I think that's actually preferable when you're going to be doing these long answer questions, because you don't want to get stuck on some inconsequential syntax error that wouldn't lose you any marks, but will highlight and annoy you the whole time you're trying to do the question. For example, forgetting that it's for array list, it's dot size instead of dot length or something. That, a compiler, if it's got the real time error highlighting, would, be there and annoy you and bother you, and you wouldn't actually lose marks for a minor thing like that. So this is the software I'm going to be using for this. So anyways, we'll get back to the question. The first question has this preamble about these dice notation. So in a lot of games, especially my favorite, Dungeons and Dragons, oh yeah, it requires you to use all these polyhedral dice that are, different sides. And so the way that they tell you, oh, you need to roll a 4-sided dice or an 8-sided dice is with these sort of D4, D6, D8, D10, all these things. That tells you it's identifying a particular dice. And then for the purposes of our program, we want it to, if it's a D4, we want to generate an integer in the range of 1 to 4. And any one of these numbers will be equally likely to be produced. Not doubles, of course. We're only looking at integers because dice, that's how they work. They generate discrete integer values. There might be some dice out there that doesn't. I don't know, but I don't care. That's what this assignment's all about. So that's how this works. It's a D4 means a 4-sided dice. A D20 is a 20-sided dice, and so on. You could, and don't worry, you could have a D15, a D13, whatever. I don't know if that's. I'm sure it's physically possible. Somebody somewhere can make that happen. I'm sure, but although they're not common, your program won't somehow not include those possibilities. So to go a little bit further, you can also put a prefix integer in front of a D4, for example, to say how many D4 are you rolling. 20 D6. I've rolled more in Dungeons and Dragons. When you do a lot of damage, some enormous spell, you can end up rolling a lot of dice. So there's some kind of integer prefix, and there's no size limit on this, and technically there's no size limit on the side of dice either. It could be a quadruple digit number, even though such a dice doesn't exist. But we're not going to be prejudiced against reality. We're going to allow this to do any sort of thing. So any number of dice can be rolled with any number of sides. So again, a 20 d6 means you are rolling 20 6-sided dice. All right, so this is basically the format. There's always going to be this D in the center, and it's going to have some value of number of dice on this side, and here's the number of sides those dice will have. So there you go. That's the setup, and we're going to make a class that will represent a simple dice notation, encapsulate, I should say, a simple dice notation statement. So it's going to have the following information. So in instance variables, it tells us that we need to store the number of dice in the simple dice notation and the number of sides those dice have. And then the constructors are supposed to make 3 of them. We're going to have the default one that's just going to make a 1d6 as a sort of values for, 1 for the number of dice, 6 for the number of sides. That's our default. We have a second constructor that takes a string as a parameter. The string will basically look like something like this, and we have to extract the 20 and the 6 out of it and assign it to the correct places in our instance variables. And then there's also a hint about using, I guess the hint isn't here. I put somewhere a hint. Yeah, integer.parseInt can be used to convert a string to an int. So that's how we'll do that. Last but not least, we have a copy constructor. It's going to take another simple dice notation object and copy its values, its instance variable values. And so those are the constructors we'll make. Last but not least, we got 3 methods. We're going to have a roll method. It's going to roll each of the dice. And it says specifically each die should be rolled separately. Like, I don't want you to come up with a formula that will produce the numbers. You need to roll each, like if there's 20 d6s, you need to loop a d6 being rolled 20 times. The other, I guess I wouldn't mind if you came with some elaborate formula, but that actually exactly simulated that. But I don't want you to think, oh, I'll just times the result by 20 or something like that. Like, that's definitely not the way it works. You got to roll all the die, not just roll one die and times it by 20. So that's the story there. Again, integer.parseInt, probably not that useful actually when I think about some of these numbers. Yeah, I don't think we actually need this integer parseInt here. I think it was mostly here that we need it. So, whoops, sorry about that. Second of all, we need a toString method. So if we print out our simple dice notation statement, it'll produce this. It's sort of the reverse of the constructor that takes a string. It's going to take our integers and package them into a string and return it. Last but not least, we're going to have an equals method that'll compare and return true or false. So let's see. I guess that's the end of question 1. So let's see the answer to it. So I'll begin with the instance variables. It says x and n. I don't care if you ended up using x and n. I just wanted to put those out there to make it easier for us to compare solutions. If we all use the same variables, it's a little bit easier for me to mark them all, and also for you to, if you're talking with somebody about them. So these have to be ints. So our instance variables, of course, go at the top of the class. So I'm going to say int x and n. These are 2 ints that we've created, and I don't know. Actually, I think I'll put them on separate lines. You don't have to, but I will. For funsies' sake, I'll say this is the number of dice, and this is number of sides on the dice. I'm not sure how to further annotate that, but I'm just going to leave it like that. That's good enough. So we have 3 constructors. These constructors will be public. They have to be public because how else will a client class instantiate a simple dice notation if they're private? They don't have any return value, so no int or void or anything like that. And then their name is the same as the class. Simple dice notation. Whoops, got to spell right. So here's a constructor, and this will be our default constructor, so I'll just make a comment. A default constructor is a constructor that takes no parameters. So if you are asked to make a default constructor, that's what it should look like. And then you're just going to code in whatever it's supposed to do according to the question. There's also a constructor that takes a string as a parameter, so it's basically going to be exactly the same as this one. Public. Same naming conventions. Notation. Hard to type and talk at the same time. Maybe it's not for most people, but it is for me. Strung. I'll put SDN for the name of the string. So yeah, you can have a second constructor. You got to make sure it has different parameters, and this is just the parameter that the second constructor is supposed to have. There's no special name for this one. I'll just call it the string constructor. You do not have to annotate your solutions on the AP exam, by the way. It's not a bad idea if you have the time. At the end, you might want to just jot in some notes if you have time left over, but it's absolutely not required. Last but not least, there is a copy constructor, and there was no explanation about what that's supposed to be in terms of the syntax. You just had to know what that means. So that means it takes another simple dice notation object. Oh, look at that. It even has autocomplete. Another good reason to use this Atom software. I'll call it SDN. Great. So now we have the copy constructor as well. So we just have to kind of follow the instructions of what to do for each one of these. So I'm going to be assigning the default values. I'll say this dot x, not that you have to. I could just say x here. X equals 1, n equals 6. This would be a perfectly valid solution. I think for this video, though, I'll be using this dot x just to remind you that that's a way you can refer to your instance variables within the class. And that does sometimes get you out of hot water. If, for example, if you had parameters or other variables that were called x or n, this would be a way you could differentiate from the instance variables and the other variable that you named x. You could just not name them x and n, though. That would be fine. But, you might, well, I guess you won't have to read code too much on this. I don't know, maybe you will. There might be some reading of code you have to do, so I'll just put this .x in here to make sure it's clear. This one's a little bit harder, hey? The string constructor one requires you to break the string into two components, the prefix number and the suffix number, and then convert them to ints and assign them. So I think we'll do that using index of. There's other ways to do it, I'm sure, but you can do sdn.index of D, it's capital D, I guess. And that will return the index of the capital D that's in the string. And that's what divides. The D is actually not needed except to separate the two numbers. So we'll find the index of that. Now I'll put in, I guess I'll call this D index. Now, it has no information. I think actually it says somewhere in the question that you can assume that the string will be properly formatted. I don't know if I put that in there. I'm pretty sure that is my intention. That will be the intention of any program that you have to write. You probably won't have to do a lot of error checking on it, unless it specifically says in the question that you should check for strings that are improperly formatted. So we're not going to do that. But I got my D index here. Should I capital? I don't know, whatever. So D index will tell me where is the D. So then I can do substring to split the string into different parts. So I'll have the string, the number of dice will be the front. So it'll be sdn.substring. It'll be from 0 to D index. And you might be like, oh, do I have to do -1 here or what? So remember, substring works so that it starts at this number, including this number, and goes up to this number, but not including this number. So this is the correct way to get that. I can get string num sides, and that will be sort of the tail end, sdn.substring, and you could put in dindex +1 because the first number is inclusive. And you could put in the end of the string. It's pretty easy to find the end of the string. It would just be sdn.length with parens, although they won't take marks off in the AP exam if you forget those parens. But it turns out that if you just give substring 1 parameter, it will assume that you're going to take from this number to the end of the string. So we can save ourselves some pain and not type in that parameter. Alright, so then I just have to convert num dice and num sides to ints and assign them to our instance variables. So I'll just say integer.parseInt num dice and integer.parseInt num sides. Done. Alright. So we'll go on to the last one. It is the copy constructor where we're sent an SDN object. You really got to make sure you don't do something like this equals SDN or something like that. That's not what we're doing. That doesn't make a copy. We want to extract the values from the instance variables of our parameter and then put them into the instance variables over here. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? Oh, snap. I forgot to put in private. Oh, man, oh man. Yeah, very important to put in private because that is part of object-oriented design philosophy that these variables are not accessible from your from the client code. So that's important. And the reason why this reminded me is because private means that these variables are only accessible inside of this class. That means also that I can access SDN's private information as well from within this class. So in client code, I couldn't say SDN dot X, but here I can. So I can directly transfer that over. So this dot X equals SDN dot X. This dot N equals SDN dot N. This is completely okay and actually required because there's no methods that allow you, like accessor methods that get X and N in this class. Okay, so there we go. We did the constructors. Woohoo! Now we got to do the methods. So I go back to the question, and we have a roll method, and we have a toString method and an equals method. So toString and equals are actually special methods that have specific design criteria that you have to include. So we'll talk about that. Roll is just one that we're making up, so you can just make it according to the question. So we'll start with roll. Roll is supposed to return an integer, so it's a public one because you need to be able to access it from the outside. So int roll, and it doesn't take any parameters according to the question. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll all of our dice X number of times, and the roll itself will involve N because that'll help us determine the random number. So what I'll do is put in here a sum variable to keep track of the sum as we go. Sum. I'll initialize it to 0. It's important to do, otherwise you could get some errors. A Java compiler could complain about that. And let's put in our loop. I'll just do a good old for loop. Use I as our stalwart friendly counter, and we'll set it to 0. And then we'll do I is less than this dot X. That's what X's purpose is how many dice to roll. And then I plus plus. So I is entirely just functioning as a counter to keep track of how many times we've rolled the dice. And then we need to roll the dice itself. So that's going to use math.random. And the way math.random works is it returns a number between 0 and 0.9 repeating. It doesn't quite get to 1. And that's important to keep in mind as we figure out this formula. So what I'd like to do is extend this to to give us the correct range that we want. So what I'm going to do is multiply this by our number of sides. So let's say we have 4 sides. So this statement here will generate a random, not an integer yet, but a random number between 0, because 0 times 4 in this imaginary example is 0, and then all the way up to, but not quite 4, so 3.999 repeating. So that gives us between 0 and 3.9 repeating. I will then truncate or no, I forget the word, but chop off the decimal with a casting operator. Int. So chop off the decimal right here. So now I get between 0 and 3, but of course I don't want between 0 and 3, I want between 1 and 4. So I can just add good old 1 on that. Now I still have a problem here because the order of operations, this will happen first. Oh no, so you have to review your order of operations. If I did it this way, this is probably the most common mistake I'll see. Then this gets cast to 0 because this number is between 0 and not quite 1. So then this will chop off the decimal to make it 0. That times 0 is 0 and then plus 1. So it doesn't actually turn out to be random. So we would need to do this first. So you can use parens, just like in math, BEDMAS, to make this happen first, then chop out the decimal and add 1. And then, of course, we will add that to our sum. So that's how we generate a random number in a range between 1 and n. And of course, we'll do this x times, and then we'll return sum at the end. Okay, good times. We'll do the toString method and the equals method next. First, toString. So a toString method returns a string. It has to be public because it's meant to be used from client code. It has no parameters, and it's basically going to return a string that's going to look like, 20d6 or something like that. So it'll be this.x plus d plus this.n. And anytime you concatenate with a string, it promotes this int to a string. So this doesn't have to be a string. As long as you got a string here and a value here, like a number, or any primitive, it'll promote to a string. So that's a nice way to do it. And that's it. And then last but not least, the public equals, public Boolean equals method. It does take a parameter. It's going to take an simple, there we go, simple dice notation object. And I guess we should give it a name. SDN is what I've been calling them. So it takes a simple dice notation object, and it's going to compare it to this one. So we can say some kind of statements along the lines of, we can use an if statement to say if those are equal. I like to just return the Boolean statement. So something like return this.x equals sdn.x and this.n equals sdn.n. So instead of saying if this is true, return true, else return false, you can just return the Boolean statement itself. It'll return true or false. So that's how I would do that one. All right, I think we're done. Question 1. So thanks for listening. Hopefully that helped clarify anything, and I hope that you enjoyed doing this question. And I'll do another video for question 2 coming up soon. Thanks, everybody.